Ärete. All right. We are going to do our assignments on word studies. And I was just able to find a nice little plugin where I can time you. And based on the number that are here, we really do have to stick to it. And so here is you got 2 minutes. And you can watch as your time is going. So be about halfway through with whatever you're going to say in 2 minutes. Hey, if you get done in 1 minute, that's fine too. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? Does anyone just want to volunteer to go first? All right, Trevor's got it. And so we can capture audio. Okay. It just clicked on. And you'll be able to see it from here. So if you'll just click the buttons.
When you start, not 15 seconds
Yeah,
later.
for real. Oh, you were already on it. Nice. Is it going?
You may have to click it again once the...
You have to like really mean it. Oh, it locked it up.
Let me go over here.
I broke it.
There we go. 3, 2, 1.
Okay. So for my word, I chose the word deacon, or actually deaconess. And specifically, the passage I started with was Romans 16:1. And the reason that's of interest is in the NIV and the RSV, they say, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon or deaconess of the church at Cenchrea. ESV, New King James Version, New American Standard, basically all the other reputable translations translate it as servant. And so that was kind of the question that drove my study is what is this word? So if you look into it, the Greek word there is diakonos, or specifically in this case, diakonon or diakonon. It's a noun, accusative, feminine, singular. Freiberg gives 4 different meanings for the semantic range. First one is generally a person who renders helpful service, translated as a servant or helper, and gives Matthew 20:26 as an example. Second meaning is an official in the church, like a deacon, and he says it appears as both masculine in 1 Timothy 3 and probably as feminine in Romans 16:1. So he also suggests that it's an office of the church there. Third meaning is a government official. Fourth meaning is one who serves as a high official, an attendant, or servant. So the conclusion that I drew based off the semantic meaning is that the New King James Version, New American Standard, ESV translate it well when they say that it's a servant there in Romans 16:1, that she was a servant or minister of the church. And the reason being that that's the first and primary meaning, and so that's kind of the default meaning that should be accepted unless you've got something in the context that says otherwise. And there's nothing in the context that says that she was serving as a formalized official. And then the third reason being, if you back on out to the remote context and look at 1 Timothy 3:8, the qualifications for a deacon is that the deacon rather be a husband of one wife. And in 1 Timothy 3, the word for deacon is always used for the men, and the women are referred to there as women. So consistency with the context too. Oh, that's it. Thank you.
Very good. So that illustrates well.
Yeah, you need that, don't you?
So that illustrates well what we're trying to accomplish. Is notice how he kind of went through the steps. He showed how you have a passage that is different in various translations, and then it went through, looked at the Greek word behind it, looked at the range of meaning, then showed why the context pushes toward not an official role as a deaconess, but she is simply a servant of the church. All right, does anybody have any questions about that? All right, number 2, who's up? All right, Tony's next. Reset. And you can clip that on. Yep. When you're ready.
Okay, cool. All right, mine is about the word answer in the New King James and the King James in 1 Peter 3:21. Baptism saves us, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. But the New American Standard and the ESV say appeal, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but the appeal to God for a good conscience. Not only do appeal and answer have different meanings, but they actually have opposite meanings. So the Greek word is eperotima, and it is noun, nominative, singular, neuter. According to Thayer, it has two definitions. One is an inquiry or a question. Number two is a demand. And Thayer paraphrases 1 Peter 3:21 like this: baptism now saves us not because in receiving it we have put away the filth of the flesh, but because we have earnestly sought a conscience reconciled to God. So Thayer clearly says that appeal is the correct translation, and the context also demands it, because you don't come to God because you have a good conscience already, but because you are seeking to have your conscience cleared. The verb, that noun is only found one time in the New Testament, 1 Peter 3:21, but the verb form is found 59 times, and 55 of the 59 times it is translated ask. The other times it is desired, demanded, or questioned. Never is it translated answer. So in this passage, the word answer in the King James and the New King James seems to have no foundation whatsoever. It's not anywhere in the definition, and it certainly does not fit the context. The other translations that have appeal seem to be the correct translation. Appeal to God for a good conscience.
Very good. Does anybody have any questions for Tony there?
And New King James.
Would they have used that word because answer has a different definition?
Because what?
Well, why would they have used that translation? Did you find that out?
No, I could not find any reason. It seemed to have no foundation.
Does anybody have any insight on that?
Well, I don't know that I have any technical insight, but I've always thought that clear conscience might be a better thing to go with the appeal, because if this is an answer of a good conscience, it means that your conscience is operating correctly, and so someone whose conscience is pricked would thereby answer God's call. But the fact that they use good, I would say appealing to God for a clear conscience. And you even use it in some of your discussion there. And clear conscience to me says something a little different from good conscience. I see clear as one that has nothing weighing on it, whereas good conscience is a conscience that is operating correctly.
Yeah, but if you're looking at the Greek of it, it seems to have there's no justification for the word answer, the translation answer. It's not part of the definition, and it seems not very well to fit the context.
So, thanks for that information. We'll see if anybody finds out why the King James made that interpretive decision. Send us all an email or something. That'd be helpful.
I was really surprised when the New King James didn't change it.
Right.
That appeal and demand and that kind of word is used much more often in other translations.
All right. Who wants to go next? All right. Brad's up. Reset.
Too much stuff here. Go ahead. All right. In Second Peter chapter 5, and I have no idea how to click this thing on. 2 Peter chapter 5. Let's go one more time. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5. There we go. The things that Peter asks us to add diligently to our faith: virtue, knowledge, self-control, so on. The thing that heads the list there is virtue. We find that word virtue appear in the passage you're all familiar with, Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, noble, just, so on and so forth, if there's any virtue, or as the New American Standard translates it moral excellence over there in first, or rather Second Peter, and or just excellence here in Philippians 4:8. But he says you meditate on these things. So what's the nature of that word virtue? Well, number one, I think it's interesting that if you go back to Second Peter, it immediately has preceding the passage where I picked up in verse 5. If you start in verse 2, in his greeting, he says, "Grace, peace, and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as his divine power has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue, by which you have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises." So I think it's interesting that one of the things that God calls us by is something he calls us to. In other words, he has demonstrated his virtue. That's one of the things that impresses us about God. And so we want to be more like God. And it shouldn't surprise us there that Peter immediately follows on and says, you start adding this to your character. I actually first encountered this word in a history class. The Greek word, it's ἀρετή, is what it is, or arte, or however you want to pronounce it. But I remember the history professor saying it really comes, it has a long history in classical Greek. It's the idea of achieving excellence. And he said, if you had to translate it with just one word, we don't have a great one in English, but be all you can be from the Army is sort of might be the best way to translate it, if you could spare a few more words. But I think it's interesting that you hear God, who is all you can be in a sense of virtue. And he says, you be like that. Strive for moral excellence.
Good. Very good. Yeah, a number of years ago, I actually did a word study on that ἀρετή and found it, it's 3 or 4 times in the New Testament, something like that. It is quite interesting, especially tying it back to the classical. So does anybody have any questions for Brad on that? Now, I'm looking at the time, and if you think you're going to get out of this, just realize we have one more class left. So, some have already mentioned that they don't want to actually orally give their report. So what you can do is email me, and then if you're still willing to orally give the report, then if we need the time, we'll push into the next class as well. Who wants to go next? All right, Michael, our first non-deacon.
And nowhere to plug this little thing up.
I keep losing my mouse over here. There it is.
Does that work? That works.
That'll work. Tell me when you're ready.
Whatever.
3, 2, 1.
All right. The word I chose was weakness, specifically from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, where God is actually the one that's being recorded here, saying that my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Specifically, God uses this word, weakness, here. If you go through the lexicon, it kind of interprets as sufficient for you is my grace, for my power is in weakness is perfected. The word is pronounced, from my understanding, it's astheneia, and it's from the word asthenes, which it has an A at the beginning of, which means the opposite, and then asthenes is strength, so the opposite of strength. It occurs 23 times as the Strong's 769, but there's also other versions through 770, 772, and a couple of others that use that root word. The word is used by Paul, God here, recorded by Paul, John, Luke, Matthew, and the Hebrew writer. It can be, the semantic range would be from physical weakness, sickness, illness, kind of like Paul at Malta, where he was healing diseases, or even like Timothy, when Paul wrote to Timothy about Timothy's frequent infirmities or his stomach. But it also can be used from a kind of a spiritual range, or from a soulful weakness, meaning like a lack of spiritual fortitude, or as it's referenced in Romans chapter 6, infirmities in your flesh, or something along those lines. As we get back to this verse, it helps us to realize that it's like in Romans chapter 8, that the Spirit helps us in our weakness. It's the same kind of thought there. So as he's saying, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness, the Strong's come along and reminds us that it was Jesus's weakness in which he was crucified. So it's that same kind of thought. And so it's our dependence on God through difficulty, through trouble, that sustains us, not our own strength. That's the thought there.
All right. Anybody have any questions for Michael? All right. And again, notice it's easy to go through those steps. You find the English word, you find the Greek word, you find out the range of meaning, you look at the context, and then you bring it back to your verse, and then you can say in an informed way, this is what it means. And for those guys who might be up front, or for you ladies who are doing a ladies class, you can take this and incorporate it right into your studies, where you make an application point from that. What application would you make from Paul's talking about weakness there? And we can show that we find our strength in God. And so I'll notice that word studies can be helpful. They just going through those steps actually outlines for you a nice little short talk or a point in your lesson. There was something that Michael did that is helpful is notice that the strong words, especially if they're spelled alike, they will give you the roots right around it. And so you can look at the adjectives, the nouns, the verbs, all the related words, and that's sometimes helpful. All right, very good.
But that word, if it has an alpha at the beginning, the root word would not be anywhere near that in the concordance, right?
No, it was like 749 or 7,000 something, brother.
Yes. And here's one nice thing about Strong's is that he'll often give you the number of the root that goes with it if it has. That's actually called, I don't know if I mentioned this in class, but when you put an alpha on the front, it's called an alpha privative in Greek, and it negates. So alpha privative is what negates your root. I do not like this, that this little app within hides my mouse so many times. It takes forever to get it back. All right, who wants to go next? All right, Jeremy's up.
We're gonna mark them.
Three, two,
Okay.
1.
Oh well.
All right.
You want me just to run a time?
Yeah.
It's easy enough, I'm fine.
All right.
I guess
Well,
you
then
can't
they can't see it.
Yeah.
So go 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, so I went to Romans 8, verse 18. It says, not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us or in us. That phrase that is to be revealed, apocalypto, is the root word apocalypthene or something along those lines is the actual word in the passage. It's a verb, aorist, passive, infinitive. The range of meaning is to uncover or lay open what has been veiled, to disclose or to make bare. And then the other one that they gave was to make known, manifest, to close what was before unknown, metaphorically. So that second one, disclose what was before unknown, is more the idea in this passage. In context of the passage in Romans 8, verse 11, it says, but if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you. So the idea of our bodies being transformed is what comes to mind. So the idea of previously non-existent coming to being, and then it relates to glory, which was mentioned just before, not worthy to be compared with the glory. So an interesting connection that I saw was how the making bare portion of the definition, that language is related to doxa of the glory and the just the transformation that we have in eternity. Save time.
All right. Anybody have any questions for Jeremy? That is an interesting finding there, that laying bare and doxa idea. And that's what is interesting as you start really reading through your New Testament or reading through your interlinear, is you'll start to see little root connections and other things that just you wouldn't see without looking into the Greek. And and then once you really start reading it over and over again, you'll see this word here, and then you'll go, oh, that's the same word that's being used over here. And so it's always an interesting experience. Again, adds color to your study whenever you see those little things. All right, who wants to go next? All right, I saw Joshua's hand first. Let's see. I think I have to reset it over here, unfortunately. There we go. Tell me when you're ready.
Ready.
3, 2, 1.
All right. So I chose the English word fervent, and there's actually, it's translated, several Greek words are translated as fervent. So I chose the one in Romans 12:11, which is zeo. Literally, it means to boil with heat or be hot. So that's interesting because in the context, it's being used figuratively. So reading in Romans 12, starting in verse 10, it says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." So it's not boiling there. So the figurative definition is going to be fervent in spirit, but you can see the connection there. What the picture, the imagery is. It's not used in the Bible as the literal definition. It's used one more time in Acts 18 verse 25 in the figurative definition, where it says, speaking of Apollos, this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, but he was only acquainted with the baptism of John. So same word there used for Apollos. But I did look in Homer's Iliad, and he uses the word to mean boiling of the water. So there we have.
So, Mike, so what, based on the findings there, what do you think what kind of application would we make with that? Let me ask it that way.
Shows the intensity of the word. When you think of fervent, it shouldn't be something that's just kind of halfway done. It should be boiling.
Very good, very good.
Revelation. It should be either hot or cold, not in the middle. So.
Very cool. Yeah, good. Anybody have any questions for Joshua? All right. Who wants to go next? Jacob? All right. Staying on.
Just get this unfolded first. All right, go ahead. All right, so the word I chose was taken from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, where it says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." Oh. Now, the word I wanted to look at was the word translated drinking parties there, since this frequently comes up in discussions of social drinking and alcohol. So the word behind it is the Greek word potos, which unfortunately, when trying to figure out the meaning, only occurs once in the New Testament. So Thayer would define it as a drinking bout or carousal. Strong's has a very similar definition. But I wanted to try to look at, what does that look like? How is the word used? So I dug into usages in the Septuagint, and it occurs a few dozen times in the Septuagint, if I recall correctly. Just to give an example, it's frequently used to translate the word feast. For example, in Genesis 19, when Lot is calling in the angels, he sets a feast before them. It's the word potos. At Pharaoh's birthday feast in Genesis 40, when it's discussing that, uses the word potos in the Septuagint. So there's times when it's used of a feast in general without any particular reference to drinking. But there are times when it does carry that connotation of some kind of drinking feast. For example, Nabal in 1 Samuel 25 talks about him having a feast when Abigail came to him and that he was very drunk in that context. So clearly alcohol could be involved in these. The difficulty, I think, in applying the Septuagint use of the word, for one, is that it's very general. Also, in this context, earlier in verse 3, it talks specifically about doing the will of the Gentiles. And so it seems to be pointing to maybe a Greek usage of the word rather than a Hebrew. Now, we do have some help, though, because it mentions this in line with drunkenness and revelries. And so there's clearly a alcohol connection here. I really want to dig more into other Greek sources to try to figure out more specifically what this would have looked like for them. So unfortunately, I don't have a real particular or precise image that I can draw for you, but clearly this was some kind of feast involving alcohol in the context.
Very good. And anybody have any questions for Jacob? He's got his preliminary study here.
Yeah, it says that in your drinking, the definition, the actual definition is do include drinking. Is that correct? Thayer and Strong.
Yeah, Thayer and Strong's, yes. I don't know if, so the Septuagint, uses it in times when there doesn't seem to necessarily be drinking implied. And I don't know if that's just an older use of the word or just a broader use of how it might be used commonly. Now the word, from what Strong's was saying, I didn't put this in my notes, but it is connected, I believe, to the Greek word pinio, which would mean drink. And so that seems to be the basic, where the word comes from. It seems to be the root. But it seems to have been applied sometimes more generally.
Right. And something to maybe, it might be another word to consider with it is how the Old Testament and the New Testament use the word wine. Because if it's a general enough meaning, you could have a feast that involves a drinking of wine, but not in the sense of alcoholic drink. It could be a happy feast like they would have done in the Old Testament. But then, of course, if you have alcoholic wine, then you move into to that realm. I think it is good for you, as you notice that context, to consider if there is any kind of development. It seems where you got drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties. Maybe we're kind of stepping down each time, so maybe do a word study on each of those other words as well. So good preliminary study. Jacob actually messaged me when I was out and about yesterday, said, is there any way to get a hold of Greek terms associated with Josephus and Philo? And I said there is, but I don't know if there's any free version. So anyway, if you're interested in pursuing that, I think I could get you a print off of all the times it might be used in those. Does anybody have any additional questions? All right, who wants to go next? What's that? All right, Caleb, and then we'll go back to Kayla. Are you ready?
Yep. I chose the word ungodly, which is the Greek word asabis. I was looking at Jude chapter 1, verse 4, where it's talking about how certain ungodly men crept in unnoticed. This word can mean anything from without reverence towards God, or it can mean someone who's actively condemning God. In passages like Romans 4, verse 5, and Romans 5 verse 6, it seems to be talking about people who just don't know God and are without reverence toward him. But in Jude, in verses 4, 8, 15, and 16, it's talking about how these people are actively working against God. So I think this word here is taking on both meanings. These people don't revere God in any way, but they are also actively working against him. They're condemning God's righteousness in place of their own.
Excellent. So while you're still up there, what application would you make of that?
I just think I was just looking how the word stronger here. It carries like more. I'm trying to think how to word this. These people are farther gone, it seems like, than the people in Romans 4 who could still be saved. These people seem to be as hardened as they could be.
Absolutely. Very good. And I think what you could do is there in Jude, if you wanted to develop this into a short talk or something, you could expand and see how does he address those ungodly people, because you see that repetition all the way throughout. And at the end, I think he may discuss that idea. I think you're kind of on the right mark where you say these people are too far gone, because you've got, at least in the New American Standard, you've got three groups who are discussed. You've got those who are starting to doubt, you've got those who need to be pulled out of the fire, and then you've got those who just pity them and try to avoid contamination. And so maybe we're seeing that influence of the ungodly, and save those you can, not much you can do with those other people. So, good observation. I think that'd be a good thing to develop and good application. Anybody have any questions for Caleb? All right, good job. Yeah, exactly. That would deal with some of that. Actually,
For that, anybody thinking of saying as a particularly holy Christian, not just any Christian.
yeah. What's the common phrase? I'm no saint. If you're a Christian, you are. And it is interesting. You have that word there. Rough breathing. Oh yeah, right there. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Is the root form IU? So there's your dative plural, I think. I think the base form is IU. Ni? Okay. So I may be thinking of a different root with the same IUs. But what is interesting here that since we didn't really get to dive into it, I'll mention it here. If you're studying through and you find an adjective like we just saw with holy, what will happen is you can put an article on the front, just like we talked about with participles, and you can make that into like a noun. So the good, the bad, the ugly, this is the holy ones. And then the word that was used was saints, because that comes from Latin, the sanctify idea. So yes, just be aware that you might do a word study, and it might be translated as a noun in your English Bible, but it's actually an adjective that's acting as a noun. And that's where translating it as the holy will be helpful for you to see this is a description, not a person, or not a group, or however you would say, substantive. Right. Very good. So, good observation. I think, let's see, we're about out of time. So, raise your hand if you didn't do one and you want to do one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's what we're going to do. The next time we have class, which should be a week from Wednesday, so no class Wednesday, no class Sunday. I hope everyone will be here. That'll be the 28th, I believe. If you are willing to report your findings, we'll do that first thing when we get to class. Then that may leave us about half of the class to work through some questions that you might have. Some of you have already brought some questions to me. We'll address those. If you don't want to give a report here in class, email me just so that I can see how you went through your steps. Does anybody have any final comments or questions about anything? Perfect.